Welcome back. We are joined today by Scott Ritter, a former U.S. Marine, intelligence officer, and UN weapons inspector, to discuss some of the things which are now happening here in Europe. So thank you very much for taking the time. We are seemingly reaching the end game now in Ukraine, it would seem, which is reason for optimism, but also it could be a quite dangerous time, as in defeat, countries are often willing to take great risks. So it seems, at least for the Europeans now, they seem to be very split between this option of a dangerous escalation or accept a very humiliating defeat. So what do you see happening now on the front line, as well as on the diplomatic front?
I mean, this is that which I and others have been saying is inevitable. I mean, this is the inevitable collapse of Ukraine. The Ukraine venture was unsustainable. Militarily, Ukraine simply can't slug it out with Russia, even when backed by the material and financial assistance of Europe and the United States. We're now seeing Ukraine economically. It's a literal basket case. There is no functioning economy. It's all artificial, propped up, corrupt as the day is long. We see a very difficult winter approaching for Ukraine. Their energy infrastructure has been taken out. They're now going to the generator economy, which means that prices for everything, even under optimal conditions, will rise 20-25% this winter, and that's 20-25% in an already dysfunctional, non-functioning economy. This will lead to political collapse, and we see that happening right now. I mean, all around Zelensky, the walls are falling. I don't know how much longer he can hold on, if he's capable of holding on, if people want him to hold on. He was always a figurehead around which different power structures were constructed, and we see now one of the big power structures, the Yermak power structure, totally collapse, and there's really nothing to replace it. And then we layer on top of that just the fact that Europe is just 100% dysfunctional when it comes to Ukraine. All talk, no action. They're incapable of any real action. I'm not worried about any escalation from Europe because they can't escalate. They have nothing to escalate with. So it comes down to the United States managing the fall of Ukraine, and this, in the end, is what we're witnessing here. Is this a helping hand, or is this euthanasia? We don't know exactly what's happening right now. One thing we do know is that Russia's in the catbird seat here. They're driving this. All they have to do is sit back and literally point to the scoreboard. Anytime the United States hesitates, tries to play tough with sanctions, just point to the scoreboard, because Russia just keeps scoring every day, more and more, and there's nothing left for the Ukrainians. So we're approaching total collapse of the military, and when that happens, it's over. It's unconditional surrender. And so the United States, in many ways, it's a race against the clock to see if they can get Ukraine to agree to something that allows something called Ukraine that isn't totally controlled by Russia to exist, or if Russia just gets everything at once.
So, well, the economy is, of course, melting down. Militarily, they seem more and more defeated every day, as the Russians are now rushing faster and faster forward. But the political meltdown is interesting. And of course, it intensified with the departure of Yermak, who I was a bit surprised. I thought Zelensky would hold on to him at all costs. But to a large extent, he was taken down with this anti-corruption agency. You said that America might be managing the decline or exit of Zelensky. To what extent, though, is this anti-corruption agencies influenced by the United States? Because as we learned from the beginning, the politicians, the military, the intelligence agencies, the media, a lot of this has been under very strict American control. Is the anti-corruption agency also a tool for the U.S. to, I guess, have some influence over who sits in Kiev?
I believe so. I mean, I don't have proof to this. This is purely speculation on my part. But the United States tolerated Ukrainian corruption, encouraged Ukrainian corruption. Some could say benefited from Ukrainian corruption, so long as Ukraine was able to deliver the goods on the battlefield, to have a robust defense, carry out counteroffensives on call, invade Kursk, all these things. The United States held their nose. I mean, it was so blatantly obvious when Congress would not even allow auditing mechanisms to be put in place because they know the truth. The truth has been known from day one that Ukraine is fundamentally corrupt from the top to the bottom. There's no aspect of Ukraine that's not corrupt. Even the anti-corruption forces, they don't work for Ukraine. They appear to have been, constructed at the behest of the United States as a mechanism of control. According to um, Ukrainian telegram channels, to take that as a grain of salt, but historically, they've actually, I wouldn't quote them except that historically they've been fairly accurate in reading the tea leaves of Ukrainian politics and calling things out. They say things, and then a couple of weeks later, it turns out what they said was true. So they say that the NABU, the anti-corruption organ, has the goods not just on Yermak but on Zelensky. That they have his voice knee deep in this current, Michinik or whatever the guy's name is, Michnuk, a corruption scheme. But we've known this. I mean, that's why this isn't a shock. We know that they take a cut of everything, that this is how they stay in power. This is how they build, um, power structures. This is how you build your allies. It's your ability to funnel money into their pockets for the ability to get contracts to them. And many of these contracts are the equivalent of mafia, no-show jobs. You want to do construction in Brooklyn? Well, then you got to fund 50 jobs. 40 of them, people will show up. 10, nobody shows up. You're just paying for 10 bodies that the mafia pockets it. And that's how Ukraine has been functioning from day one. It's not a surprise to anybody. So for corruption suddenly to become an issue means that somebody wanted it to become an issue. And there's only one nation in the world that has that kind of power over Ukraine. That's the United States. So I do believe that this is a mechanism of pressuring Zelensky, manipulating the system. Um, and if I was a Ukrainian, understand every single one of them is corrupt. There's not a clean person there. Everybody on that negotiating table is owned by the United States. When we decide to make them fall, they will collapse like a house of cards. That's my take on it.
Well, you mentioned before that the Europeans can't really escalate because they don't have the armies. I won't push back against this, but we've seen some more bold behavior from Ukraine. That is attacks on these Russian commercial ships, which well referred to as Shadow Fleet or Dark Fleet, or the branding kind of is obvious. But Erdogan now complained that and expressed concern, given that there have been attacks on a Russian oil tanker within Turkey's economic zone. Do you see this as being desperate, I guess, attacks towards the end of a war, or trying to prove that Russia can be beaten, or how? Well, what are the risks of these attacks, though?
It's British driven. I mean, let's just be honest here. When we're talking about Ukrainian, naval drones, this is a 100% British driven operation. Um, And it's the Brits have been, screaming the loudest about the shadow fleet influencing the Balts to do things. So this is just a desperate act on the part of Great Britain. It'll have zero impact. I mean, these aren't Russian ships. I think one was Panamanian flag, Turkish-owned Panamanian flag. The others were Ghana or something, African flagged ships. Yeah, they're part of the so-called shadow fleet of uninsured or vessels that are outside the Lloyd's insurance umbrella that Russia can rely upon to move oil, despite the British-driven sanctions. But you know, it's just going to backfire. I mean, already we see Turkey condemning Ukraine's action. Kazakhstan and nations that were sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause are now, shouting out. They attacked a oil platform that pumps Kazakh oil, costing the Kazakhstan over $1 billion. That's how long do you have diplomatic support when you pull do stupid stunts like this? So this is just British stupidity. This is the Brits, stiff upper lip, boys. We're going to stick it into the very end. Yes. Stand your ground, the thin red line. Except the Brits aren't dying. It's the Ukrainians are going to pay the price, and they're going to pay a horrible price. They will be abandoned by everybody when this is done. Nobody likes them. I said this from the very beginning. The only thing that makes Ukraine attractive is the money that goes into people's pockets. There's nothing attractive about Ukraine. It's not a functioning democracy. People don't look to it and say, this is the model we want to follow, boys. Good old, Poroshenko democracy, European equivalent of Jeffersonian democracy. No, nobody likes the Ukrainians. Nobody respects the Ukrainians. Everybody despises the Ukrainians. But so long as Ukraine is able to funnel money into people's pockets, and it can be used to, empower people geopolitically. I mean, hell, Europe's had a great moment there, allowing the Ukrainians to die by the hundreds of thousands for them. But it's over, and Ukraine will be abandoned. There's only one nation in the world that will ever put out a helping hand for Ukraine, a sincere helping hand. And that's Russia. And Ukraine's going to learn that in the future, because that's their only salvation is through Russia. Unless you're a Western Ukrainian, then you die.
Yeah, that was actually a comment by Zelensky's former advisor, Arstovich. He was making the point that, ironically, the only two countries who would actually fight and die for Ukrainians were the Russians and the Belarusians. Ironically, because they're the ones now who are in war with them, given that they made themselves a frontline. So to Ukraine. So he said that the main correction now, if he was president, he would just first day he would go to Moscow and promise that the Ukraine would not allow itself to be used anymore as a frontline against the Russians. Well, it seems very predictable now, though, that once the proxy war is over, that the Ukrainians will be thrown away, as happens towards the end of a proxy war. But what does this mean for the peace deal? Because it does seem, irrespective of all desires to put an end to this war, given that, well, NATO, we are losing the war, so we'd like to put an end to it. But there seems to be a great reluctance to put a permanent end to it. That is, we would like to, well, continue to have in the future, I guess, a proxy Ukrainian army, which we could use against Russia if we would want to escalate tensions. But so I'm very split on this peace deal. In some ways, I'm quite optimistic, given that some pressure is actually put now on Kiev and the Europeans. On the other hand, I'm a bit skeptical, because one doesn't really get the impression that they're ready to give up on, this final opportunity to break Russia.
Well, but listen to your last statement. Final opportunity to break Russia. Do you think the Russians are so stupid they don't understand this? I mean, that the Russians are just dumber than dirt. I listened to somebody say, oh no, we'll do this peace deal. It'll be so that, the Russians will think that they won. Wow. So the Russians are really the dumbest people on the planet. They're children, and you can hand them, a lollipop and tell them it's dinner or something like that. No, the Russians are the smartest people at the table right now. Their diplomatic corps is genius. Do they make mistakes? Everybody makes mistakes. But Russia knows exactly what's going on. Putin has said from the very beginning that this war won't be over until the root causes of the conflict are resolved permanently. So what the hell does Europe think they're going to do? You think Russia's going to sit there and go, okay, yeah, we were just kidding. We're not going to solve the root causes. We're going to leave Ukraine there so that you can pump them up 10 years from now, and we can do this all over again. That isn't going to happen. There will be no peace deal that allows this to happen. None, zero. And Russia's in the driver's seat. There's no pressure that can be brought on Russia right now to make them change their mind. None. And, right now we have the Trump administration solely focused on financial gain. I mean, traditional geopolitical thinking's out the window right now. Europe is nobody cares. That's just the reality. You don't matter. It's just over. Uh, they're not even coordinating with you, not even calling you. They had their meeting, with the Ukrainians, and Rubio doesn't even get to make a phone call to Europe. He doesn't get to go to Rubio. Just gets to go back and play, Venezuela games. Witkoff and Jared are off to Moscow to do the thing. Why? It's all a business deal right now. And I'll tell you what, Russia has far greater business potential than Ukraine does. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to sway the United States. If Ukraine doesn't want to play games, then Russia will absorb Ukraine. And Trump has already acknowledged this. And then the United States will indirectly be able to reap the benefits of Ukrainian resources by having business deals with Russia. But this is coming down to one giant business deal. Is it going to succeed? I don't know. I don't know if Trump has the ability to pull this off, because there is a lot of political opposition to this in the United States, and there is midterm elections coming up. But the idea that you're going to strong arm Russia into accepting a deal that doesn't give Russia what it's going to get if it just continues fighting, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop this outcome on the battlefield, it's over. It's all over but the dying. I mean, there's a lot more Ukrainians that can be killed, and Russia tragically is willing to kill them, if that's what it takes. But Europe is it doesn't even register anymore. It's embarrassing to be European today. Literally, I'm sorry, but you earned it. You earned it through your sheer incompetence and your lack of ethics and your lack of morality and your lack of anything. You allowed Ukraine to be sacrificed as a proxy, and now you're paying the price because there's nothing there. I mean, I don't know how many times I have to hear Germany and France and everybody talk about this 800,000 man army that they're going to build. Good luck. I wish you the best. Please build it. That'll just further your collapse because you can't afford it. And there are 800,000 Europeans ready to fight and die for your cause. Already in Germany, 16% of and I think that number's dropping as we speak. 16% are willing to die for Germany if they're invaded. How many of them are willing to die for Germany if Germany invades somebody else? So Europe's just irrelevant. It comes down to Trump, and can Trump, game this system? And we'll see. I'd like to know just what he has on Ukraine, because because remember, the problem with corruption is a two-way street. And if you start playing the corruption card, it may come home to roost, meaning you may find out things about American politicians you don't really want to find out. So Trump has to be a little bit clever here how he puts the pressure on the Ukrainians. And the good news, though, is that the CIA knows everything about Ukraine. We've owned Ukraine for a long time. We own every single one of these guys. They're all on our payroll. We have files on them. We know every dirty secret about them. Everybody. And we can play it, as we want. But like I said, at some point in time, somebody may not be willing just to sit there and quietly go down. They may start bringing out the receipts, and the receipts may be ugly for many American politicians, including Trump, by the way.
Yeah. Well, the foolish thing is that the complaint now, again, from the Europeans, not that it matters that much anymore, but that this can't be accepted in peace now because it would look like capitulation. But again, if they wanted a more balanced outcome of the war, they could have done things earlier. I mean, if you go back to 2014 or February, a unity government was that would have been enough to solve the internal crisis in Minsk. With the Minsk agreement, they could have reintegrated Donbass into Ukraine. And now, after 3 years of having no diplomacy, a deal only gets worse and worse. And still now, they don't want to call it. For me, this baffles me. They don't want to talk to Moscow, but they want a seat at the table at the negotiations. I'm not sure how, they would just sit there and condemn them. I'm not quite sure how that would actually pan out. But I saw now from a report now from General Saluzhny in London, where he makes the argument that any peace deal that doesn't eventually result in the collapse of the Russian Empire is pointless, he said. So, but he's favorable of a peace agreement because it will give Ukraine time to rearm and prepare for future clashes, which again is a Minsk III. It's very strange, given that the deal will only get worse the longer they actually
Russia will
wait.
never go for Minsk III. To do Minsk III, you have to have leverage on Russia, and there's nothing. I mean, I just came back from Russia. Um, you know, we'll just look at some realities. Putin's getting ready to go to India this week, I believe, where they're going to, shake hands, embrace, and ink massive energy deals. So the idea that India is going to lock the Russian oil out of its market isn't going to happen. So that the secondary sanctions isn't going to work. China's already thumbed their nose at it. And what's the United States going to do? Go in a full-scale trade war with India right now? No. And he's going to buy, Russian weapons. They're going to talk about massive, trade. This is what BRICS means. Trump didn't beat BRICS. BRICS is still there. So, the pie in the sky thing about collapsing the Russian economy, understand this. Unlike Europe, the Russian economy has a fallback, meaning that let's just hypothetically say that all the sanctions hit the way they're supposed to hit. And Russia finds itself strapped for cash, can't afford this war. If it was just your traditional capitalist, finance-driven economy, you'd have a lot of problems. But see, all the big industries in Russia are joint stock companies where the state owns most, if not all, of the joint stock. Russia can militarize their economy that quick. Just a war mobilization economy overnight. Bam. Don't even miss a step. People's savings won't be there, won't be accessible. There'll be things that have to happen. People have to tighten their belt. But you can't beat Russia. You can't beat Russia. It just isn't going to happen. And so I don't know what Zelensky thinks is going to happen here. There's no pressure that can put Zelensky is over, finished, done. He has no viability. There will be no future in Ukraine. He will spend the rest of his life in London working for MI6, playing stupid games, trying to round up Banderist elements to infiltrate back into Ukraine and revive Ukrainian nationalism, things like this. The same thing that Khodorkovsky does, with his billions sitting there in London trying to mobilize Russian businessmen against Putin. It's an MI6 fantasy, a wet dream. It isn't going to happen. There will be no peace deal the way Europe thinks there's going to be, what Ukraine wants. What there will be is unconditional surrender. Now, it might be packaged so it sounds like a peace deal, but this war doesn't end until Russia gets 100% of everything at once. And the longer this goes on, Russia's appetite grows. Just the reality of it. Russia's not going to yield on any of this. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, the appetite growing is, I've seen some indications of this as well when in the past they used the language of cities being taken in Sumy or Kharkov. Now they're saying liberated, which is kind of an indication that the demands for a peaceful settlement will only grow, I guess, the longer this goes on. On the other hand, I did warn that it would grow if the Europeans, in the West, would prolong this. But what does this mean for the wider security structures and the political West? Because again, this war, if we're honest, it's about the cause of this is the collapse of the pan-European security architecture, the post-Cold War dream of creating a Europe without the Russians. That is a hegemonic vision of Europe fitting the unipolar world. But now that this is collapsing, what happens? Because the whole point of NATO was, keep the American in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. It looks like the consequence of this war is that the Americans will begin to pull out, not completely, but it's impossible to keep the Russians from having a seat at the table. I mean, we can deny them a voice and a seat at the table, but if you deny them institutional voice, they will assert themselves in other ways. So it's not very smart. So what does this mean for, I guess, America's hegemony, the future of Europe, and yeah, the role of NATO?
If I were the Europeans right now, I would go back and pick up that Russian draft treaty that they provided on December 17th, 2021 to NATO, and I'd blow the dust off of it, and I'd put it on the table, and I'd ask the United States to come to the table with their copy, and I'd turn to the Russians and say, we're ready to talk. Make the Russians react to you. All right? Make the Russians begin the dialogue now. Why? Because the more responsibility you show towards having a conducive approach towards bettering genuine European security framework, the more Russia will not be paranoid about, your intent on Ukraine. Let Russia win in Ukraine. They've won. Accept it. What you need to do now is save NATO if that's what you want to do. And the only way to save NATO now is to sit down and talk with the Russians about a European security framework that allows an empowered Russia to peacefully coexist with a weakened but still robust NATO. There will be a gray zone. There will be part of NATO. There's people out there who have misconstrued what rollback to 1997 means. It doesn't mean that Poland, the Baltic states stop being NATO. Russia's never said that they have to leave NATO. What Russia says, though, is that the military infrastructure that has been pushed east since 1997, that has to come back. For instance, the ballistic missile sites in Poland and Romania, they have to go. Massive NATO bases, they have to go. That the Eastern European nations will be NATO nations protected by Article 5, but they won't be bases from which NATO can project power against Russia. This is what needs to happen if you want to create a security framework. And instantly the savings, it's amazing if you did this, how much savings Europe would have. Because now you're talking about a completely different military, enterprise. You're not talking about building up the world's largest, 800,000 man force to fight the Russians. You're talking about normal security structures that protect the integrity of Europe in a sustainable fashion and if you play your cards right, that keeps the United States linked in a transatlantic relationship. That's your backup. The United States doesn't, the connectivity between the United States and NATO is just deep. And we don't necessarily want to leave. We just don't want to be involved in a shooting war with Russia where NATO calls the shots. We will never be subordinated to NATO. But if NATO is smart, they'd make sure that they'd be able to have a realistic European security framework backed by the military might of the United States. That's their security guarantee. That could lead to, genuine, geopolitical stability that could serve as the basis for an economic revival. This is Europe's chance, but you gotta start by respecting the fact that Russia exists and Russia exists with, spheres of interest and influence. It's just a reality. You can't continue to talk about NATO having spheres of interest and influence and Russia having none. The fact is both have spheres of it, and there will be areas where these spheres, overlap. And in there, you need to come up with, if you look at this 28-point peace plan and the vision of the Trump administration, there is talk about this. There is talk about how to, work with Poland, to deal with the reality of, Poland being right there on the border. How do you make sure Russia doesn't view Poland as a threat while still protecting Poland? These are some of the topics that need to be discussed. How do you make the Baltics feel safe without, making the Russians say, hey, you're just a hop, skip, and a jump away from St. Petersburg, or, you keep threatening to cut off Kaliningrad, or you keep threatening that the Baltic is a NATO lake. You've got to find a way, got to find a balance there. It can be done, but it's going to require Europe to just fundamentally change, its direction, and it's going to require new leadership because the old political and economic elites that empowered themselves with the notion of this constant Russian threat that justified, because NATO expansion and EU posturing are hand in glove. When we speak of independent European Union foreign policy, it's really independent foreign policy in terms of casting Europe as a counter to Russia. Um, that's old thinking. It failed. It failed fatally in Ukraine. Europe has a chance to salvage itself, because otherwise, if they don't, Russia's going to get what they want anyways. Because NATO will collapse, the EU will collapse, and that's it.
That's one of the greatest challenges, I think, of overcoming this post-Cold War, the hegemonic order for Europe, because you don't have to worry about the security competition under hegemon, because by definition you don't have to care about what other centers of power think. But this idea that we only have to deter the Russians, that what you refer to is reducing then the security competition. Again, how do the Baltic states, how can they feel safe without us threatening the Russians? This required this shift from the hegemonic mindset to recognizing the security competition. I think it's a bit sophisticated thinking that our current leadership could struggle with. But again, they see the Ukraine war and territory as being the cause of this. But again, the Ukraine war is a symptom, a consequence of this broken Europe. And the territorial dispute is, again, a consequence of the unwillingness to manage this buffer zone. But just my last question though is what do you expect will happen now in the absence of a peace deal? Because the territorial defense going from Gulyapole to Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Siversk, Kupiansk, all of it seems to be falling apart or already fallen to Russia. So how does this change the nature of the war? Because this was a very important defensive line which held the Russians back, and this is collapsing. Not only would the Ukrainians have much fewer troops, less equipment, less support, but their defensive lines are gone. So I don't know. I can imagine if I was sitting in Moscow, I would not be in the mood for a compromise now. So if they do not make a massive compromise, given that they finally punched through this last major defensive line, well, what would you expect happen now if you would use your military intelligence background as assessing what the Russians could be thinking?
Well, war is an extension of politics by other means. I mean, that's old Clausewitz there. We can also, I'm sure Sun Tzu said something similar at some point in time in his many pronouncements about war and politics. We have to be careful and thinking solely militarily. I mean, because it's very tempting right now, because we've reached the culminating point where Russia now will be able to militarily accomplish things that up until now they haven't been able to. I mean, Odessa is within reach. It is. It's not inconceivable. There's nothing in Kherson right now. If the Russians collapse the Zaporozhye front and come in and cross the Dnieper River in strength, and then they decide to pivot south, the right bank of Kherson will fall along with Mykolaiv, and then they're at the doorstep of Odessa, and nothing can stop them. But now, there's been some frustration expressed in certain circles about Vladimir Putin's lack of, killer instinct. Why hasn't he decapitated, Bankova? Well, because he thinks bigger than simply decapitating Bankova. Remember what came before the special military operation is the Russian Draft Treaty for European Security Framework. Russia's thinking in the long term, what's in its best interests. And right now, if Russia can secure the 4 territories that it claims because of the September 2022 referendum, and here's an important thing, and get the United States and Europe to recognize these as Russian territories. If they can end the sanctions that are linked to Crimea in this and normalize economic relations with the world, contrast that with winning military, seizing Odessa, maybe even getting Kharkov. But nobody in the world will recognize this. And along with that, nobody recognizes, and it's a forever situation where sanctions are going to cost you trillions of dollars over the course of the next decade. Strategically, where do you go? And I've just been impressed with Russia's ability to think past the glory and think strategically about where it needs to be down the road. BRICS doesn't function well with one of its members in a permanent state of economic conflict with the West. That's not for a healthy BRICS. And Russia wants BRICS to succeed. Russia wants to be part of BRICS. And the best way that Russia integrates into BRICS is to be a fully functioning nation state with an economy that can be plugged in anywhere in the world, especially with the United States and China simultaneously. So I still believe that Russia's looking for an off-ramp. There is a negotiation there. It's a fine balance. It'll be interesting to see about elections because, the United States, again, there's just some fascinating things going on behind the scenes, unspoken things, the kind of stuff where two people sit at a table and sort of look at each other and give that nod, like, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, I know what you're talking about. We're not going to say it, right? We don't need to say it, you know. And what I mean by this is the United States, it appears that we're moving towards a total redefinition of what Ukrainian government looks like, to break these power structures that have held Ukraine together since it became an independent state. Why would we do that? Why would we break everything and reform something to benefit Ukrainian democracy? It doesn't exist. The Russians, on the other hand, are sitting there with a government in waiting. They have a plan, they have a vision. It'll be difficult for the Russians to slide in if they have to slide into the old traditional corrupt structures that exist because Russia doesn't readily integrate into that. But if you break that and you create something new through this peace process, Russia slides in. And Russia, therefore, doesn't need to occupy Odessa, doesn't need to occupy Kharkov. What they do is they give Ukraine options. One, for Ukraine to become part of the Union state. And then Ukraine is like Belarus, visa-free travel. Why? Odessa will be a Russian city. It'll be governed by Ukraine, but it'll be a Russian city. It's visa-free travel. The Russians will now come in. They'll be rebuilding everything. They'll own all of Ukraine. Ukraine will be called Ukraine, but it'll be functioning as a de facto extension of Russia. I think that's the Russian vision. And they can get to that through a semblance of a peace deal. That's a more realistic vision than the one of Europe, retaining the Ukraine that can forever strike Russia. But if Russia moves too fast militarily, seeks to, do too much, they spoil that. Because then what happens is everybody becomes defensive. Russia has to be careful not to be that which Europe accuses them of being. And, a pell-mell rush to occupy territory, to seize territory, to be seen as seeking to grab all of Ukraine, I think Russia would prefer to avoid that. The other thing is it will require more manpower. I mean, the bottom line is, the Russians now have manpower that can take them a certain distance. But to go even further, you're going to need to mobilize additional manpower. I don't think Putin wants to do that. I think the economy right now is geared to be able to sustain at the present rate another year or two of of this kind of activity. But to mobilize even more manpower will put strain on the economy. Where's that manpower going to come from? From defense industry jobs, or are you going to weaken the civilian, economic structures so that we start to see collapses of the civilian economy that now has to be propped up at expense and harm to the Russian economy? I think the Russians right now are working with the Trump administration to find a balance that gives Russia everything it wants, but also creates opportunities for Russia going forward that don't require the military to be flexing its muscle. And this is where, again, the Russians, people always, people are just fundamentally ignorant about Russia and what's going on in Russia. I've had the honor and privilege of being able to go into Russia and talk to these people, and you speak to them, and you see that there are things happening that the West just either ignores or just isn't aware. Um, there is significant philosophical dialogue going on in Russia about the future of Ukraine, and how to deal with Ukraine that goes far beyond the notion of killing Banderists and and conquering territory. It's a far more sophisticated philosophical, ethical approach to conflict resolution than anybody in the West gives Russia credit for.
Yeah, no, I think dumbing it down to mere struggle over territory, I think this is one definitely will miss the bigger picture. So, well, thank you very much for shedding some light on this. I appreciate it, and I hope that they will find this balance though, so they won't so they won't have to go for this total military victory. So, thanks again.
Okay, thanks.